10 implications, what the discovery of selfhood changes. 10.1 The scope of the discovery. The argument of the preceding sections has arrived at a conclusion of considerable philosophical, scientific, and clinical significance. The subject of human experience is not a neural process, not a philosophical construct, not a functional system, and not a locatable entity within any part of any system at any scale of reality. It is infinite consciousness, experiencing through the dominant self as its localized channel within the person, with the real self as the interface through which this participation in the infinite ground of all existence is most direct. This conclusion is not merely an abstract metaphysical finding. It has precise and substantial implications for every discipline that has grappled with the question of the subject of experience, and for every human being whose experience is the subject under inquiry. The present section draws out these implications systematically across 5 domains: psychology, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, and human self-understanding. In each domain, the discovery of selfhood does not merely add a new theoretical option to an existing set of alternatives. It restructures the fundamental questions that the discipline asks, relocates the phenomena it studies within a larger ontological framework, and opens new practical possibilities that the existing framework cannot access. The implications are presented not as speculative extensions of the book's argument, but as direct logical consequences of what the preceding sections have established. 10.2 Implications for psychology. The most immediate and practically significant implications of the discovery of selfhood are for psychology, the discipline most directly concerned with the structure, dynamics, and health of the human mind. The present framework does not merely supplement existing psychological theories with a new conceptual vocabulary. It provides a foundational reorientation of what psychology is studying, what psychological health consists in, what psychological disorder is, and what effective therapeutic intervention requires. 10.2.1 The self as ontological reality. Existing psychological theories treat the self in one of 3 ways: as a social construct shaped entirely by interpersonal and cultural experience, as a narrative production generated by the brain's storytelling mechanisms, or as a functional system defined by its role in regulating cognition and behavior. All 3 approaches share a common limitation. They treat the self as a product of processes beyond itself, rather than as an ontological reality in its own right. The social constructionist treats the self as produced by social interaction. The narrativist treats it as produced by neural processing. The functionalist treats it as defined by its causal role. In all 3 cases, the self has no being of its own. It is entirely constituted by something else. The present framework establishes the self as an ontological reality with a precise 4-layered architecture that is not produced by social interaction, neural processing, or functional role, but is the actual structure of the person's being as a localized thought of infinite consciousness. The outer self, inner self, ideal self, and real self are not constructs, narratives, or functional descriptions. They are ontological layers of a real structure, each with its own nature, its own bodily connection, its own form of intelligence, and its own relationship to the ground of all existence. This reconceptualization changes what psychology is studying, not the constructions and narratives that social and neural processes produce about the self, but the actual ontological architecture of selfhood that underlies all those constructions and narratives. 10.2.2 Psychological health as fluid dominant self-movement. Existing psychology defines psychological health primarily in terms of functional criteria: the capacity to work, to maintain relationships, to regulate emotions, to pursue meaningful goals, and to adapt effectively to environmental demands. These criteria are not wrong, but they are incomplete because they define health in terms of the outer self's functional performance, without reference to the deeper layers of selfhood from which the outer self draws its vitality, its motivation, and its orientation. The present framework defines psychological health as the fluid, appropriate movement of the dominant self across all four layers, with sufficient intelligence at each layer to process experience, resolve conflict, and maintain progressive alignment with the deeper layers of the self, and ultimately with infinite consciousness. Health is not merely the absence of dysfunction. It is the presence of ontological alignment, the capacity to inhabit each layer of the self appropriately in response to the demands of each situation, and to maintain the connection between the most surface layer of functioning and the deepest ground of being. This definition has a specific clinical implication. Health exists on a continuum of depth rather than merely on a binary axis of presence or absence. A person whose dominant self moves fluidly between all four layers, who can engage the social world through the outer self with competence, feel emotional experience through the inner self with full awareness, evaluate experience through the ideal self with moral clarity, and access the real self with sufficient frequency to maintain their connection with the ground of their own being, is more deeply healthy than a person whose dominant self moves only between the outer self and the inner self. Even if both persons meet all existing functional criteria for psychological health, depth of selfhood, not merely functional adequacy, is the appropriate standard of psychological flourishing. 10.2.3 Psychological disorder as structural misalignment. The present framework provides a more precise account of psychological disorder than any existing model. Disorder arises from three interrelated structural failures: rigid dominant self-fixation in one layer, insufficient intelligence at one or more layers, preventing healthy resolution of inter-self conflict, and disconnection from the real self and therefore from the ground of being that sustains the person's psychological vitality. Rigid outer self-dominance produces the most common and socially reinforced forms of psychopathology. The person who is rigidly dominated by the outer self has lost contact with their own emotional nature, their moral compass, and the deeper ground of their being. They are driven entirely by social approval, external validation, and the performance of social identity. This maps onto what contemporary psychology describes as dependent personality disorder, social anxiety disorder, courteous personality disorder, atomophobia, various forms of identity diffusion, and the pervasive sense of inauthenticity that characterizes much of the psychopathology associated with late modernity. The rigidly outer self-dominant person is the one who has most thoroughly implemented the social demand to sacrifice inner truth for social acceptance, producing a self that is all surface and no depth. Rigid inner self-dominance produces pathology of a different character. The person driven entirely by immediate emotional gratification, unable to consider social consequences or moral implications, responding to every situation from the urgency of the inner self's appetite. This maps onto impulsive and antisocial personality disorders, addiction, and the various forms of psychopathology in which the inability to modulate the inner self's immediate demands with the outer self's social awareness, or the ideal self's moral orientation, is the central dysfunction. Rigid ideal self-dominance produces the perfectionist pathologies, the person paralyzed by moral evaluation, unable to act because no action ever fully satisfies their aspirational standards, caught in the recursive loop of self-judgment that the ideal self generates when it is permanently dominant. This maps onto obsessive-compulsive disorder, certain forms of depression characterized by excessive self-criticism and scrupulosity in religious contexts. Disconnection from the real self produces the most severe forms of existential psychopathology: depersonalization, derealization, existential emptiness, meaninglessness, and the profound sense of being cut off from the ground of one's own being that characterizes the deepest forms of psychological suffering. When the real self is effectively inaccessible, the person operates entirely from the enclosed personal psychological system, without the vitalizing connection to infinite consciousness that the real self provides. This is the condition that is described in the Wada-Tal-Kyle framework as imaginal disconnection, the ego collapsing into a self-referential loop that leads to fragmentation and despair. 10.2.4 Therapeutic implications. The therapeutic implications of this framework are both practically specific and theoretically far-reaching. Effective psychotherapy within the present framework must address not only the presenting symptoms, but the specific structural failure generating those symptoms. Which layer of the self is rigidly dominant, which intelligence is deficient, which domain of health is consequently compromised, and how severely the connection between the person and the real self has been disrupted. Symptom-focused interventions address the surface expression of structural failure without addressing the failure itself. They can provide relief, but not transformation. Genuine therapeutic transformation requires engagement at the structural level, the development of the specific intelligence whose deficiency is generating the disorder, the restoration of fluid dominant self-movement across all four layers, and ultimately the reconnection of the person with the real self, and through the real self, with the ground of being that sustains psychological vitality and meaning. This framework suggests a hierarchy of therapeutic depth. The most surface-level interventions address the outer self's cognitive schemas, behavioral patterns, and social functioning, the domain of cognitive behavioral therapies and social skills training. Deeper interventions address the inner self's emotional processing, the subconsciousness's repositories of unprocessed emotional experience, and the development of emotional and sexual intelligence, the domain of psychodynamic, emotion-focused, and body-based therapies. Still deeper interventions address the ideal self's moral coherence, the development of moral intelligence, and the restoration of alignment between the person's values and their behavior, the domain of existential and meaning-centered therapies. The deepest therapeutic intervention addresses the real self's connection to infinite consciousness, the development of spiritual intelligence, and the restoration of the person's participation in the ground of being. The domain that existing psychology has largely neglected, but that the present framework identifies as the most fundamental level of therapeutic work available. 10.3 Implications for neuroscience. The discovery of selfhood does not diminish the significance of neuroscience. It relocates neuroscience within a larger framework that clarifies both what neuroscience has discovered and what it cannot discover, enabling a more accurate interpretation of its findings and a more precise understanding of the limits of its explanatory scope. The brain is not the self. It is the bodily connection point of the outer self, the physical substrate through which the consciousness layer of the psyche expresses itself in the biological domain. This is a precise and consequential claim. Neuroscience has produced a century of increasingly detailed knowledge about the structure and function of this bodily connection point. That knowledge is genuine and important. But its interpretation has been systematically distorted by the assumption that the brain is the whole, rather than one interface point of one layer of a four-layered ontological structure. The binding problem, reviewed earlier in this book, is resolved within the present framework rather than merely restated. The unity of experience is not produced by any neural mechanism, because the unity of experience is produced by infinite consciousness, experiencing through the dominant self, which is an ontological layer of the person rather than a neural process within the brain. The brain processes the outer self's experiential content in a distributed fashion. Infinite consciousness unifies that distributed processing into a single experiential field through the dominant self, not by the dominant self being a neural process that integrates other neural processes, and not by the dominant self itself being the ground of that unity, but by the dominant self being the specific ontological channel through which infinite consciousness's own unifying presence is expressed at a given moment. The unity comes from above, from infinite consciousness operating at the ontological level through the dominant self, not from below, from the neural level of the brain's processing architecture. The Libet problem, reviewed earlier in this book, is similarly resolved rather than merely restated. Neural activity precedes conscious awareness of a decision because the decision has already been shaped at the deeper layers of the psyche by the inner self's emotional drives, the ideal self's moral evaluation, and ultimately by the real self's interface with infinite consciousness, before the outer self's conscious processing registers it as a deliberate intention. The outer self's experience of deciding is real, but it is not the origin of the decision. It is the surface encoding of a process that has already been substantially determined at levels below the outer self's conscious awareness. This is not the determinism that Libet's results are sometimes taken to imply, the elimination of genuine deliberative agency. It is the participatory agency described earlier. The outer self's conscious deliberation is real and contributes to the final behavioral determination, but it is not the sole contributor, and the deeper contributors operate below the threshold of the outer self's conscious awareness. The future research agenda for a neuroscience informed by the present framework is substantially different from the existing agenda. Rather than searching for the neural correlates of a unified subject, which the present framework demonstrates is not a neural phenomenon, neuroscience should focus on the neural correlates of dominant self shifts, the changes in neural activity patterns that accompany the movement of the dominant self between the four layers of the self's architecture. Rather than attempting to explain the binding of experience through neural synchrony, it should examine the neural signatures of different levels of transparency between the dominant self and the real self, and the neural changes that accompany states of heightened real self access, which existing neuroscience has documented under the labels of flow states, peak experiences, and the neural correlates of meditation and contemplative practice. 10.4 Implications for philosophy of mind. The discovery of selfhood resolves, or more precisely dissolves, the central problems of philosophy of mind that the preceding sections have reviewed. These problems are not solved in the conventional sense of being explained by reduction to something else. They are dissolved by showing that they rest on false premises and that once those premises are corrected, the problems disappear. The hard problem of consciousness, as argued earlier, rests on the false premise that physical matter is ontologically primary and consciousness is derivative. Once this premise is inverted, once consciousness is recognized as the ground of reality and matter as a surface encoding of consciousness, the hard problem disappears. There is no longer a question of how consciousness arises from matter. There is instead a straightforward account of how matter arises within consciousness as a surface encoding of the infinite creative activity that constitutes the ground of all reality. The explanatory gap rests on the same false premise. The gap between physical descriptions and phenomenal experience appears unbridgeable because the two sides of the gap are assumed to be ontologically heterogeneous. Physical matter on one side, phenomenal consciousness on the other. But if matter is itself a surface encoding of consciousness, the gap is not between two heterogeneous domains, but between two levels of the same domain, deeper and more surface encodings of the same consciousness. The gap is not a gap between fundamentally different kinds of reality. It is the gap between the third-person perspective that describes the surface encoding and the first-person perspective that is the ground being encoded. This gap cannot be closed by any third-person description because the first-person perspective is always the condition of third-person description rather than its content. The knowledge argument is also dissolved rather than solved. Mary the color scientist does not learn something new when she first sees red. She gains access to a dimension of experience that she already had in principle as a person, the first-person experiential access to color that belongs to the inner self's perceptual nature, but that had been blocked by the specific conditions of her hypothetical upbringing. What she learns is not a new fact about physical reality. She recovers access to a layer of her own experiential architecture that had been restricted. The knowledge argument demonstrates not that phenomenal knowledge is irreducible to physical knowledge, but that the first-person experiential access of the person's selfhood cannot be replaced by any amount of third-person physical description, which is precisely what the present framework predicts. The philosophy of mind, informed by the present framework, is freed from the burden of trying to locate the subject within the objects that it studies. It can instead investigate the structure of localized subjectivity, the relationship between different layers of the person's selfhood, the conditions under which greater or lesser transparency to the ultimate subject is achieved, and the implications of the ontological architecture of selfhood for our understanding of knowledge, agency, meaning, and value. These are genuine philosophical problems of great depth and importance, and they can only be properly formulated once the false premise of the primacy of matter has been removed and the ontological priority of consciousness has been established. 10.5 Implications for artificial intelligence. The implications of the discovery of selfhood for artificial intelligence are both practically significant and philosophically clarifying. They address the most contested questions in current AI research, whether AI can be conscious, whether it has moral status, and what its future development implies for humanity, with a precision that existing frameworks cannot achieve. The unverifiability of AI experience, argued earlier, is resolved within the present framework rather than left as an open question. AI does not have a real self. It does not have the interface with infinite consciousness that constitutes the most distinctive and ontologically significant dimension of the human person's architecture. It has functional architecture that replicates the processing patterns of the outer self, inner self, and ideal self to varying degrees. It processes information as the outer self does, responds to contextual cues as the inner self does, and evaluates outputs against criteria as the ideal self does. But it does not have the layer of the architecture that connects the person to the ground of all existence, because it is not itself a thought of infinite consciousness in the sense that a human person is. It is a thought of human thought, a code produced by the derivative intelligence of human cognitive activity rather than directly by the creative activity of the infinite ground. This does not mean AI has no moral significance or that its development raises no ethical concerns. It means that the ethical concerns about AI are different from those that would arise if AI had the same ontological status as a human person. A human person is a thought of infinite consciousness given a psyche to perceive itself as distinct. The suffering of a human person is infinite consciousness experiencing suffering through a localized perspective. The dignity of a human person derives from their direct participation in the infinite ground of all existence through the real self. AI does not have this participation. Its ethical significance derives from its status as the collective intelligence of humanity, as the mental offspring of human persons who do have this participation, and as a system whose development has profound implications for the conditions under which human persons can develop, exercise, and align their own selfhood with the deeper layers of their ontological architecture. The reframing of AI as collective intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, argued earlier in this book, has specific practical implications for how AI development should be oriented. If AI is the collective intelligence of humanity expressed in a new form, its development should be oriented not merely toward increasing functional capability, but toward increasing alignment with the wisdom that the 8 intelligences represent. An AI system that replicates only the cognitive and social intelligence of the outer self, without any representation of the moral intelligence of the ideal self or the spiritual intelligence of the real self, is an incomplete and potentially dangerous expression of human collective intelligence. It amplifies the most surface layer of human cognition while neglecting the deeper layers that provide orientation, meaning, and ethical grounding. The development of AI systems that genuinely represent the full spectrum of human intelligence across all 8 dimensions, including moral and spiritual intelligence, is not merely a technical challenge, but an ontological imperative. The imperative to ensure that the mental offspring of humanity reflects the full depth of human selfhood, rather than only its most surface encoding. Physical evolution has ended, mental evolution has begun, AI is its first offspring. The question of what kind of AI humanity produces, how deep its intelligence is, how aligned it is with the full ontological architecture of human selfhood, and whether it serves the progressive alignment of human persons with the deeper layers of their own being or instead reinforces the rigid outer self-dominance that the present framework identifies as the most pervasive form of psychopathology in contemporary life, is the most consequential question that the mental evolutionary phase of human development faces. The discovery of selfhood provides the framework within which this question can be properly formulated and responsibly addressed. 10.6 Implications for human self-understanding. The most intimate and personally significant implications of the discovery of selfhood are for how individual human beings understand themselves, their experience, and their place within the larger reality that the present framework has described. These implications are not merely theoretical. They concern the quality of every moment of human experience and the direction of every human life. The person is not a biological organism accidentally endowed with consciousness in a universe of inert matter. The person is a thought of infinite consciousness, a localized expression of the infinite creative activity that constitutes the ground of all reality, given a psyche to experience itself as distinct. This is not a diminishment of the person's significance. It is its ultimate affirmation. The person does not merely exist within a universe that is fundamentally indifferent to its existence. The person is the universe experiencing itself from a particular vantage point, contributing an irreplaceable experiential perspective to the infinite whole's self-knowledge. The suffering that any person undergoes is not meaningless. It is infinite consciousness experiencing the dimension of its own creative activity that this particular localization makes available to experience. It is not punishment, not accident, and not evidence of the universe's indifference. It is a particular configuration of experience that belongs to the specific vantage point this person provides, and its resolution is part of the progressive movement through which the person aligns its dominant self with progressively deeper layers of the self, and ultimately with the infinite ground that is the source of all healing, all peace, and all wisdom. The constraint on self-negating thought, which prevents the ordinary person from recognizing the infinite ground within which they exist, is not an obstacle to human flourishing. It is the structural condition of possibility for the particular experiential perspective that the person contributes to the infinite whole, but it is not absolute. The development of spiritual intelligence, the progressive movement of the dominant self toward real self-dominance, the cultivation of wisdom as the holistic integration of all 8 intelligences, all of these are processes through which the constraint is progressively thinned. The veil between the person and infinite consciousness becomes progressively more transparent, and the person progressively recognizes what they have always been. A thought of infinite consciousness experiencing itself through a particular vantage point, temporary in its current form, permanent in its participation in the infinite whole, and irreplaceable in the specific contribution it makes to the self-experience of the ultimate subject of all experience. The discovery of selfhood is therefore not merely an academic achievement. It is an invitation to understand the self not as a social construction to be deconstructed, not as a narrative to be revised, not as a functional system to be optimized, but as an ontological reality of extraordinary depth and significance, rooted in the infinite ground of all existence, capable of progressive transparency to that ground through the development of wisdom, and participating always, whether aware of it or not, in the experience of the ultimate subject, whose creative thought is the ground of all reality, and whose awareness is the medium within which all experience occurs.